Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I'm here for the Game of Tomes January/February review. If you're not familiar with Game of Tomes, I will link the video down below for the February-January comparison. This is done by Emma at Emmy Reads and Carolyn from Carolyn Mary Reads. This is an evolution of the Tolstoy versus Dickens great debate that they did over the last couple of years. They've turned it into more of a book club and discussion. So what they do is they pick one book a month, and for a 2-month pairing, they pick similar themes or similar authors to do a comparison after that 2-month period. This is not a debate where one defends their author of choice in a debate to see which is better. This is more of just a discussion. So for January, the author of choice was Ernest Hemingway and A Farewell to Arms. And then for February, it was John Steinbeck and Once There Was a War. So I'm going to be filtering in clips of their live show where they discuss this, as well as my own thoughts and impressions on these books. I actually took notes this time. All right, so let's get an overall understanding of the difference between these two books. These authors have been compared quite a bit. Sorry, Mike is just weirdly in the way. These authors do get compared quite a bit. They're definitely not identical by any means, but I can see where the comparisons come from. Ernest Hemingway is very famous for his very distinct prose, which is almost a lack of prose entirely. He will write something and it will sound like, I'm walking down the road and I see a house on the hill. The house is bombed out. I don't think anyone lives there. You know, that's about it. John Steinbeck definitely has a little bit more flavor to his writing, but it is also still pretty direct. He doesn't have a lot of flowery speech or anything, so I can see why the two of them get compared. They are both war novels. They're both from writers of kind of similar styles. They're both American writers. A Farewell to Arms is a fictional book based on Hemingway's very real experiences in World War I. He was an ambulance driver, he served in Italy, and he fell in love with a nurse while he was there. And so all of that is reflected in the book. It is very much a fiction mirroring real life in many, many ways. Now, conversely, John Steinbeck was a war correspondent during World War II. So he was actually in the war zones, not as a combatant, but as a reporter. And so Steinbeck's book, Once There Was a War, is actually a collection of his actual war correspondent dispatches during his time as a correspondent. So it is real life events collected into novel form. So you have a fiction and a nonfiction. However, they're almost flip-flopped because A Farewell to Arms is very heavily based on Hemingway's actual life, so it almost can be looked at in a way as a nonfiction, or at least a fictionalized versions of real events. And then you have Steinbeck in his introduction to Once There Was a War, who talks about how it's hard to read any of these war correspondent dispatches from him or from other correspondents and take them at face value, because he said there were multiple factors at play here, one of them, and the biggest one, being the war effort. And that was the mindset of most of the American population, the military, and the media to support World War II. And so the dispatches had to somewhat reflect the already built-up idea of what this war was like, what it was meaning, and not have any really anti-war sentiment in it, because the people back home didn't want to read that. They wanted their imagined version of what the war was. The military did not want that. And the media news institutions knew that they weren't going to get readers, so they didn't really want it either. So Steinbeck talks about also misplaced patriotism, military censorship of what was stricken from his dispatches versus what was left. And so he encourages the reader to be very skeptical when reading these dispatches, and not just taking them at face value. So you have a nonfiction that the very author himself says needs to be looked at as fiction in a way. So it's really weird and interesting to compare these two, because you have a nonfiction and a fiction. It's very difficult to try to say that one is better than the other. So I primarily focused on writing style and just overall enjoyment. So like I said, this is a review read along with Emmy and Carolyn Mary Reed's channels, where they had their live show, and just to put it out there, they absolutely both loved A Farewell to Arms. They loved it. They had a lot of emotional reaction. They loved the writing. They found it very accessible. They found some really beautiful passages, and it was more enjoyable of an experience for them overall. They really didn't care as much for Once There Was a War because it is very short dispatches about very completely separate, disparate things, places, peoples, and circumstances. And so with Once There Was a War, it's not really a cohesive story of any kind. It's really small vignettes of a very specific person, or a story about a goat and how it became the mascot of an airfield division. It's the telling of how the troops marched onto the troop ship at the very beginning of the war to be sent off to battle. There's a few stories set in London. There's a part of his correspondence in North Africa. So it goes kind of all over the place, and that lack of cohesion can make it suffer for some readers if that's not what they're looking for, or if they don't enjoy that style of writing, because it kind of reads like a series of short stories. So I completely understand the criticisms or the struggle to enjoy and get as much out of it. I do agree with Carolyn and Emma in that the introduction to Once There Was a War is probably the best part of the book. Steinbeck is very open and honest about how dishonest these dispatches tend to be, but not through any maliciousness. So it's really interesting to see him talk about his own nonfiction journalistic work in that way. And the way that he writes the introduction is great, I thought. I actually really enjoyed it, and I started annotating in the introduction itself. That's how much I was really enjoying it. They both loved Hemingway and not crazy about Steinbeck, and I'm completely the opposite. I really did not like A Farewell to Arms. Okay, you'll have to excuse the definite changes in lighting. I'm obviously right next to a window, and unfortunately it's not even facing onto me, it's off to the side. And so as the sun is going up, I'm getting light and shadow and crazy, crazy lighting. So my main issues with A Farewell to Arms is not even really Hemingway's writing style, as far as it is lacking any kind of poetic imagery, poetic dialogue, lyricism to it. I don't even have a problem with that per se. There's something about his writing style that is incredibly repetitive, and while it's very much an artistic choice, it is intentional. It's not a word count kind of thing. It was probably my biggest problem with the book the entire way through, and I do have some examples. So here is my copy of A Farewell to Arms, and this honestly starts on page 1, chapter 1. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising, and leaves, stirred by the breeze, falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare and white, except for the leaves. The plain was rich with crops. There were many orchards of fruit trees, and beyond the plain the mountains were brown and bare. There was fighting in the mountains, and at night we could see the flashes of the artillery. In the dark it was like summer lightning, but the nights were cool, and there was not the feeling of a storm coming. Sometimes in the dark we heard the troops marching under the window, and guns going past pulled by motor tractors. It goes on, but if you can see the connecting lines and highlights and things. Troops, troops, soldiers, troops. Dust, dusty, dust. Leaves, 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 brown, leaves, bare, bare, dark, dark, road bare. It's paragraph 1. This is the exact reason I stopped reading The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck in high school, because 9 pages, it wouldn't stop talking about dust, and I couldn't take it anymore. So when I experienced this on A Farewell to Arms, on the first chapter, I was like, I'm doomed. I am doomed to hate this book. And I really, really wanted to love it, or at least like it, and I really didn't. aside from the repetitiveness that I would say goes on for the first half of the book, somehow either I stopped noticing it or it kind of dropped off in the second half of the book. The other issues that I had is that his character development was absolutely minimal. Most of the characters were very shallow, very cardboard cutouts of characters. And they weren't necessarily stereotypical cardboard cutouts. What I mean by cardboard cutouts is that they had a singular defined shape, but they were flat and they never changed. There was no exploration of characters, and I feel like that's what the book intended to do. And this was something that Emma pointed out. I think it was Emma in her live show. I'm going to try to put in the clip because I'm going to try to put in clips of their discussions as I go. But she pointed out that the writing of this book is from the perspective of the main character after the events had happened. And so in a way, they are cardboard cutouts to the main character. They're stuck in the past and they're defined by this memory that he has of them. Because this is the main character telling this after the fact, that changed the way that I looked at the book. I had not really thought about that before. When Emma pointed that out, it kind of made me want to reread it because I think that looking at it through that lens would have made a difference in how I was interpreting the writing. Again, a lot of this is very intentional on Hemingway's part, but because of that, I was put off by the repetition. I was put off by not having anything to sink my teeth into in any of these characters, so that I didn't really care about the story. I didn't really care about the fates of any of these people. Some of the dialogue in here is really the best writing in the book. One of my favorites is towards the end, he kind of runs across a really, really old, I think he's like in his 90s, retired general or admiral. And he has a conversation with him about age and wisdom and things. And that was one of my favorite parts of the book. Count Greffy. If you ever live to be as old as I am, you will find many things strange. You never seem old. It is the body that is old. Sometimes I am afraid I will break off a finger as one breaks a stick of chalk, and the spirit is no older and not much wiser. You are wise. No, that is the great fallacy, the wisdom of old men. They do not grow wise. They grow careful. So it goes on a little bit, and then he comes back and he says, "What do you think of the war, really?" I asked. "I think it is stupid." "Who will win?" "Italy." "Why?" "They are a younger nation." "Do younger nations always win wars?" "They are apt to for a time. Then what?" "They become older nations." "You said you were not wise." "Dear boy, that is not wisdom. That is cynicism." I absolutely loved this. No, that is the great fallacy, the wisdom of old men. They do not grow wise, they grow careful. Dear boy, that is not wisdom, that is cynicism. It's little gems and insights like this that actually drew me into the book, but it didn't happen very often. So I was really disappointed. Like, if the book had been more balanced with those kinds of dialogues, with that kind of insight into humanity, into human nature, into the fallacies of what we think is human nature, I think I would have enjoyed it quite a lot more. At first I was going to give this thing a 1 star, and then the very end, which is a very famous ending, which thankfully I had no idea what it was going to be. And this is my brother's copy, so I saw his highlights from high school. So I knew when there was foreshadowing because he was highlighting rain all the time. And I'm like, okay, rain is foreshadowing of something. So when the end happened, I wasn't particularly surprised by it, but I found myself in tears. Like, I wasn't bawling my eyes out, but I cried at the ending. And I'm like, how am I crying? Because I do not care about any character in this book. So the fact that I could read an entire book, not particularly enjoy it, specifically not care about any of the characters, and then cry at the ending, I don't know how Hemingway did it. Again, I feel like it's a magic trick. Like, he was distracting me over here with something, and then at the very end, he's like, oh, punch you in the gut. And that's what it was. And so that made me bump it up to a 2 star. And I know Hemingway and A Farewell to Arms getting a 2 star review from somebody is probably not what most people expect. A lot of people commented on in the live show about the relationship between the two main characters, Catherine, the nurse, and Hemingway's main character, Henry, I think. Lieutenant Henry. Yeah, okay. At first, the relationship is very barely a relationship. Neither of them are taking it very seriously. Then how the characters kind of develop the relationship over time. They both kind of go into it thinking it's sort of a fling, it's sort of a replacement for something that they're missing in their lives. Because Hemingway doesn't develop anybody but his main character, Henry, it's hard to find anything in their relationship that feels true, that feels valid as far as an actual relationship that is developing. And so it's a big criticism a lot of people had. It's what keeps a lot of people from really liking this book, and I completely agree. But something that they pointed out in the live show, both Carolyn and Emma talked about this. As time goes on, as the book goes on, the relationship definitely does develop into something more accurate, more true to an actual relationship. They develop very strong feelings for each other. They care about each other very deeply. They're very loyal to each other. And you see it, but you don't feel it. And whether or not that was intentional by Hemingway, I'm honestly not really sure. I tend to think that it was intentional, but it's one of those things where you'll hear booktubers talk about show, don't tell. This book in its entirety, but it's very much encapsulated in how their relationship is discussed, is he is telling you, he is not showing you. And so there's not a lot of an emotional investment that you can make into the characters and their relationship, because he's telling you how they feel about each other. He's telling you how their loyalty and their emotional connection to each other has grown, but you don't see it happening. And so there's always this element of detachment. You are definitely on the outside looking in. Again, I definitely think it's a choice that Hemingway made. I think he's intending for the reader to feel that way. But it definitely is something that kept me out of the enjoyment of the story.
I didn't feel that. Like, I kind of got that Hemingway was, I don't know, it was just weird because I always felt detached from them, but I could see the development. And of course, like, the thing that I didn't really get until the book ended, like, you get to the end of the book and like you see that he's writing this story like after, so that the whole story is infected with like her death, by him knowing the ending, by him like everything is just tinged with this grief. And then going back and reading the whole thing, like, things start to pop up that are so devastating.
So this is so good. So this is partly why I think that it is so important to, with classic literature, to try to do a deep dive, because on the surface, my enjoyment level of this book is next to nothing. But when you discuss it, when you talk about it, and especially with Emma, who is a English lit major, and she's, gone to university and had a lot of, she's about to get her degree in English literature, English lit. She has such insight into classic literature, and I wish that I had that opportunity to be able to do that. But I really enjoy the perspective that she brings, because she talks about how much foreshadowing there is, and she talks about how when you understand how he's writing it, he's writing it from the perspective of, this is all after the fact. This is all from the perspective of somebody who is stuck in a mode of grief and trauma, not just from the war, but from the loss of this relationship. And so the book is through the eyes, through that lens. And so when I never picked up on that exactly, and so after seeing this live show and I'm seeing this, I'm like, that gives me an entirely new perspective on the book, and it also makes me want to reread it, which is it's just weird, because the idea that I might want to reread something that I didn't hate it, but that I had such a lack of enjoyment of, is just mind-boggling to me, because I think I love the work of picking some of this stuff out, because I want to like it, I want to enjoy it. That's not to say if I did reread it, I'm absolutely going to love it, I'm going to give it 5 stars or anything like that. But I definitely enjoy the perspective that these two girls are bringing to this. Completely agree. I actually, in my reading vlog review of of this book, this is one of the things I talked about, where some of his dialogue, like with Count Greffy, is fantastic, and some of his dialogue is ridiculous. Like, people don't talk like this. People do not talk like this. So one of the conversations he has is, you know what? I don't even know if I marked it because it was such an annoying passage that I'm like, I can't. I don't want to read this again. The other person that he's having dialogue with says the word cooked in pretty much every sentence. The Germans are cooked. The Austrians are cooked. The Italians are cooked. We're cooked. We were cooked before we began. I kid you not, I think it was about 20 times in a paragraph that was about this long. People don't talk like that. Hemingway has this weird dichotomy where his dialogue is either so ridiculous or it's really insightful and poignant. There's very little in between. And I don't know if that's his reflection on, he sees this character, he sees this person and this conversation as ridiculous, and so that's how it's portrayed because it's out of his memory. And he sees this other conversation with this other person as very meaningful to him, and so he treats it with a lot more care and respect. Maybe that's what it is. But some of the dialogue was a struggle to get through because you're just like, this is not how humans talk. This book could be great for a lot of people. It was great for Emma. It was great for Carolyn. I didn't love it. I just didn't. But hearing some of their insight from the live show, which I do highly recommend that you go watch, does make me want to reread it with kind of a different light. And I think this is the value of English courses in general and learning how to read and how to pull things out of literature, but to have assistance in doing that, because this isn't a natural thing that we can do, is to get inside the head of an author and figure out what they're trying to relay to us on our own. But book clubs and read-alongs can also do that for us. And I think that can happen at a time in life where, you know, I can see why high schoolers hate reading this. I am a full-on adult and I did not enjoy this, but after some discussions, I feel like I get a lot more out of it. So I think that things like this, especially classics, are definitely worth a reread. And if you struggle with classic literature, I think reading it in a group setting or a book club or with book discussions or YouTube videos on classic literature can be incredibly valuable because they enhance the reading experience, at least for me. So I would recommend reading it. If you think that this is a book that you're going to struggle with, though, I would recommend reading it in that context of trying to find other people like yourself who are trying to get something out of it. All right, and now transitioning over to Steinbeck's Once There Was a War. Right in the beginning, first couple of paragraphs, I have this highlighted from Steinbeck. Perhaps it is right or even necessary to forget accidents. And wars are surely accidents to which our species seems prone. If we could learn from our accidents, it might be well to keep the memories alive, but we do not learn. In ancient Greece, it was said that there had to be a war at least every 20 years because every generation of men had to know what it was like. With us, we must forget, or we could never indulge in the murderous nonsense again. Love it. And then, same page. So he's talking about after collecting from newspapers and from his personal papers these dispatches. Reading them over after all these years, I realize not only how much I have forgotten, but that they are period pieces, the attitudes archaic, the impulses romantic, and, in the light of everything that has happened since, perhaps the whole body of work, untrue, warped, and one-sided. Anything which interfered with or ran counter to the war effort was automatically bad. That he can so bluntly and so honestly say that looking back on his own work and how dishonest it was for a variety of reasons is so impressive. And it gives me so much confidence going into his work that I can trust him as a writer even while not being able to trust what he wrote. It's really interesting to me. I think it was very important that he wrote this introduction and that he talks about this. And this is something that got mentioned in the live show. It's a quote from Steinbeck's introduction. "It is in the things not mentioned that the untruth lies." Okay, this line got me so good. There was a general feeling that unless the home front was carefully protected from the whole account of what war was like, it might panic. Also, we felt we had to protect the armed services from criticism, or they might retire to their tents to sulk like Achilles. Wow, he just came for him. And then his introduction ends with this quote, which I absolutely love. Now, for many years, we have suckled on fear and fear alone, and there is no good product of fear. Its children are cruelty and deceit and suspicion germinating in our darkness. And just as surely as we are poisoning the air with our test bombs, so we are poisoned in our own souls by fear, faceless, stupid, sarcastic terror. The pieces in this volume were written under pressure and in tension. My first impulse on rereading them was to correct, to change, to smooth out ragged sentences and remove repetitions, but their very raggedness is, it seems to me, a parcel of their immediacy. They are as real as the Wicked Witch and the Good Fairy, as true and tested and edited as any other myth. Like, okay, this is the writing I was coming for. This is what I wanted to read. I did not know John Steinbeck could write like this. I loved the writing in this. I didn't mind the vignettes. I didn't really know what to expect being a collection of dispatches, but I really enjoyed the vignettes. And I think a big part of it is because my favorite show growing up was the TV show MASH. And if you're not familiar with it, Google it. Fantastic show, ran for 11 seasons, and it is considered one of the most accurate depictions of what it was trying to depict in wartime, which was a MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital Unit in the Korean War. So doctors, nurses, commanding officers trying to deal with wounded patients on the front lines. There's a lot of humor, there's a lot of blood and guts, there's a lot of absolutely mundane, bored out of your mind with nothing to do, and a lot of you're so busy trying to save so many lives that you'll go 3 days without sleeping, and to have a single bite to eat or a sip of coffee, somebody has to be putting it in your mouth while you're elbow deep in somebody's intestines. Steinbeck's correspondences felt very reminiscent of MASH. There was humor, there was the depiction of the mundane, because war is either all or nothing. You're either bored out of your skull or you're fighting for your life. And I think Steinbeck captured that so well in these dispatches, in these tiny little vignettes of people and places. Whereas A Farewell to Arms was a single person story from his point of view, from looking back on things that had already happened and cemented them into his mind, whereas Steinbeck is in the middle of it, writing about it as it's happening. Like the second sentence of his very first dispatch I highlighted. So the troops in their thousands sit on the equipment on the dock. It is evening, and the first of the dim-out lights comes on. The men wear their helmets, which make them look alike, make them look like long rows of mushrooms. If Hemingway had given me that just once. It's cute and charming. It's taking something that is going to be deadly, and many of these are going to die once they get to their destination, very likely, and it's turning it into something related to nature. It's turning it into something completely, wildly different than what it truly is. And to the idea of hundreds of people so jammed together that there's completely a lack of individuality, and it just looks like mushrooms sprouting up from the deck of a ship. There was something that just spoke to me about that imagery, and it's those little sprinklings of imagery that Steinbeck has woven throughout all of these that I find so relatable in his works. But he definitely talks about how the first dispatch is kind of a theme about how once they become soldiers, there's a loss of individuality. They're not individuals, they're soldiers. They're not people, they are part of the war machine. You cannot tell one man from another. With your helmet on, you were a mushroom at a bed of mushrooms. That kind of repetition, not done in the same paragraph, and not done in like almost the exact same way, I found Steinbeck's use of repetition so much more enjoyable and relatable than Hemingway's literally half of the first sentence and half of the second sentence, or two sentences apart, and he's saying the exact same thing. Another example of this repetition that I enjoyed is on the very next page. The great troop ship sneaks past the city and tugs leave her, a dark thing steaming into the dark. The place which will fill their thoughts in the months to come is gone, and they did not even see it go. The ship is a gray, misty ship slipping through a gray mist and melting into it. So now he's using repetition, but he's not just repeating the same thing. He's using repetition to compare two things. The gray, misty ship slipping into the mist, becoming the mist. Two things are becoming something alternately or completely new from the two disparate pieces that it began as. I really, really enjoyed seeing how Steinbeck's writing style lent to his storytelling of his experiences. This line, okay. The other thing that I was looking for in both of these books was commentary. Pro-war, anti-war, pro-military, anti-military, some kind of make a stance. Hemingway got tired of the war and just didn't want to be a part of it anymore, is what the book felt like. Whereas Steinbeck had very strong feelings about war in general and about this conflict in particular, and the causes and the puppeteers in the background that are leading these things. So he says here, it is gratifying to see that our new army has gone back to the old-fashioned virtues our forefathers lied about. Whoa. That's the other thing. To me, Steinbeck's work felt so much more relevant to today because of these kinds of things. There are multiple instances in his book where Steinbeck kind of reflects that same attitude of war is sold to the populace. War is, it's a machine, it is a money-making thing, it is a powerful, beast of destruction, obviously, but it's definitely more than that, because if that's all it was, it wouldn't keep happening. There's so much more, and the only people that benefit from it are the ones that don't have to fight it. And Hemingway does have some of that commentary, especially in his dialogue between his main character and his the people reporting to him, the other ambulance drivers that he works with. But most of that feeling, that sentiment, is coming from the characters who are Italian. This is their war, this is their homeland that they are fighting to defend. And they're the ones who are reflecting on how pointless war is for most of the people affected by it. But I feel like Steinbeck does that more consistently, and I feel like he does it, obviously these are dispatches, so he does it more obviously. I mean, he is putting it out there for his readers, whereas Hemingway, you're picking it up in either dialogue or subtext. And I talked about this in my Once There Was a War reading vlog, but he says there's no war song for this war. Nothing has come along yet. This is pretty early on in his dispatches. And again, this just had such a strong callback for me to a MASH episode called Dear Uncle Abdul, where Klinger is writing home to his uncle, and he's describing daily life in the camp, his responsibilities, and what's going on. And in that episode, Father Mulcahy kind of talks about how there's no war song for the Korean War. In the previous wars, there were war songs, and it was something that the general American, specifically the American population, really rallied around, and it was used to, kind of have comradeship, to have, to bolster patriotism, to make everybody on the home front feel like, they had some part in it. Propaganda, really, is all it was. And these aren't necessarily songs that were made for the war. It's songs that just were used and picked up by, the zeitgeist. But Father Mulcahy's like, it's the Korean War. There's no war song. And so one of the sub-stories, the subplots of that episode is Mulcahy trying to come up with a war song. And I highly recommend you Google Father Mulcahy war song or Dear Uncle Abdul war song. I tried singing it on my vlog. It's like a tiny, one verse. It's a really interesting episode to watch in its entirety because you see the evolution of, at first it's trying to give something to the people there to get behind and to kind of connect them. And it turns into a revelation of, why are we doing that? Why are we trying to get an emotional response out of people in support of such death and destruction? And so the episode kind of ends with him coming up with a war song that is very different than what anybody would have expected from a war song. And so going along with this, he talks about, no one has yet put words and a melody to the real homesickness, the real terror, and the real ferocity of the war. Go watch that MASH episode if you want to understand exactly what Steinbeck is talking about here. He has some really, really funny lines. He talks about when he is in England, he talks about how the English just seem to hate vegetables and they have to cook all of the flavor out of them, or it's like a personal affront to their British existence. The easygoing American attitude of allowing the vegetable a certain amount of latitude short of the ballot is looked upon by the English as soft and degenerate. So the way that Americans will not cook the ever-loving crap out of vegetables and eat them even raw, versus the British cooking them to almost non-existence into the same flavorless pile of mush no matter what the vegetable was. That kind of humor helps get through what are some very tough passages, talking about bombings. He talks about how people react to losing everything, and he has a really good balance of, showing the reader how destructive and traumatizing it is to citizens and to soldiers, and then he'll sprinkle in a joke and kind of pull you back from the brink of, this is too much. He talks about soldiers in the hospitals. He has an entire section on how Bob Hope was tirelessly visiting soldiers at the front, men in the hospitals. It was really interesting because I actually found it one of the most interesting parts, because a lot of his stories, definitely have that fictional aspect to them that he fully admits and warns the reader about. But hearing his admiration for Bob Hope and how incredible his, I'm not even going to say work ethic, but the fact that he simply existed in the way that he did with no rest is what it seemed like. Really, really interesting. And it's something that I'm a little bit more aware of, more so because of MASH and the references that it has about Bob Hope coming to, possibly coming to the unit, and, different, he was a very popular comedian at the time. And so he was very much in everybody's consciousness. And because he was so dedicated to visiting as many troops as he could throughout his career, it was very much a part of its time. And so it was interesting to see that talked about in war correspondences from somebody at the front, and what that meant to him as a correspondent, and what that meant to the soldiers, whether they were combat soldiers or whether they were in the hospital at the time, was really interesting. But as he talks about, those in the hospitals, one thing that he says was, everything that can be done is done, but medicine cannot get at the loneliness and the weakness of men who have been strong. The weakness of men who have been strong. Steinbeck has such insight into the men that he spends his time with as a correspondent, and it is, you just get these sentences here and there that just literally jump out at you. So towards the end, he is reporting on an invasion that's about to happen, and how leading up to it, the anticipation before an action is the most difficult time. Once the action is started, once men get into battle, they're able to do something. But waiting before it happens, how torturous that can be. So he says they're waiting on the deck of a ship in the moonlight before they're supposed to go into this invasion in the early hours of the next morning. And he says, men they have known well and soldiered with are strange, and every man is cut off from every other one. In their minds they search the faces of their friends for the dead. But each man in this last night in the moonlight looks strangely at the others and sees death there. Everyone is, in a way, dead already. The men sitting on the deck disappear into the blackness and the silence, and one man begins to whistle softly just to be sure he is there. I feel like Hemingway had an entire novel that pulled emotion out of me in the last like 3 paragraphs. And Hemingway's book is 332 pages long. Steinbeck pulled emotion out of me in each of these vignettes. So each dispatch is no more than 3 or 4 pages. And in almost every single one, Steinbeck has pulled an emotion out of me, whether it be making me laugh because it's humorous, making me kind of, because it's cute, the imagery is relatable, and it's told in a charming way, making me hold my breath because you're reading about a theater that was bombed and the children that they're pulling from the rubble, making, your skin prickle because you see him talking about how it's so dark and it's so anxiety ridden, waiting for something to happen, that somebody starts whistling to make sure he even still exists. I felt so much more through Steinbeck's writing than I did through Hemingway's. And to me, in this comparison, they were so different. It's really hard to compare and say one was better than the other because they felt like very different. They're both trying to do different things, and they both went about them in different ways. So it's really, really hard to compare. But I did write down. So I felt that they both had opposite goals. To me, Hemingway was trying to show the lack of humanity of war, and Steinbeck was trying to show the humanity of those fighting a war. So Hemingway was looking at war overall and how it didn't matter, there's this complete lack of humanity in the beast that is war. And Steinbeck wanted to dive in and look at the individual people who are affected by this war and showcase their humanity. And war is one of the most human things ever. It is entirely human. It is entirely a human construct for human ideals perpetrated by humans alone. And so I think they had completely different points that they were trying to make. And I do think that they both successfully made them. I enjoyed Steinbeck's telling of and making of his point more so than I did Hemingway. So who wins the argument?
So I will just say straight up which one I preferred. I preferred Hemingway.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, I've fallen in love with him so recently. I think I was just destined not to love Steinbeck as much because I'm not a fan of the short story format, especially like these aren't even short stories. These are like little flickers of the war. Some of them are so gorgeous, but I think just as a whole, I was destined to like Steinbeck so much more. Or no, Hemingway so much more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, I'm not going to leave with a Steinbeck quote. I'm going to leave with a Hemingway quote. In my copy, on page 50, who wins their version of how they feel about war between John Steinbeck and Ernest Hemingway? War is not won by victory. It doesn't finish. There is no finish to war. Nobody wins. There's no winners. There's no winners. It just goes on. And so war novels will go on, discussions of war will go on, and debate will go on. So if you only want to read one war book, which do I recommend? Do I recommend A Farewell to Arms, or do I recommend Once There Was a War? Neither. I recommend All Quiet on the Western Front. I started this book before I started either of these other two because I wasn't thinking, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to start this book without realizing that in about 2 weeks I was going to pick up A Farewell to Arms for January, and then I was going to have to read Once There Was a War for February. I am not even done with this book, but like Steinbeck's Once There Was a War, I started annotating in the introduction. I am about halfway through, and I had to stop tagging everything I was highlighting because the book would have been all tags. What's fascinating to me about this is written by a German writer who his anti-war sentiment got him in a lot of trouble and he had to leave Germany. This is his experiences from World War I, and it is fictional, but like Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, this is very realistic based on his personal experiences. The writing in this is some of the best I've ever read. It shows the brutality and the horror of combat at the front lines, but it does it so beautifully. There's so much nature imagery in here. It is poetic while also being completely straightforward. And it's interesting. I actually have a few passages highlighted from A Farewell to Arms where it's almost word for word mimicking All Quiet on the Western Front. This is World War I. This is World War I. I think they even were published in the same year. This is by a German author, though. This is The Enemy. And it flips your expectations on its head because you're reading from the viewpoint of the country that lost the war. You're reading from the viewpoint of the country that was considered the bad guys and, you know. But you get into, very much like Steinbeck, you're seeing very, very personal accounts of these people and their experiences, but told from one main character's perspective, like A Farewell to Arms. So it's almost like an amalgamation of the two. The writing is the most beautiful I have seen in a long time when it comes to the subject matter. And you care about these characters, and when they get into a scrape where you now have an emotional connection to some of these characters and you want them to survive, and they come face to face with the enemy, and you all of a sudden instinctually are like, I want you to survive, I want you to win. And you realize that means you want them to win over the Allied forces. And you're just like, wait a minute. But they're the good. I don't want the good guys losing. I don't want the bad guys winning. And I think that's what this is. What's so great about this book is that you realize these are just people. People on either side are still just people. And people are pitted against each other. And a lot of times the people fighting the battles don't necessarily have the ideology of the people who started the war in the first place. And I'm taking this very slowly because it's like I've highlighted so much of so many pages, but it is incredibly short. I just cannot recommend this enough. I'm halfway through, and it is indelibly printed into my brain now. And honestly, if you're looking for something like that, if you're looking for a very touching and moving experience that you can feel like you can connect with and that's going to change your perspective, there are a million movie adaptations of this. I think this Oscar season, Netflix did an adaptation of this that's up for an Oscar. Read the book, though. I've never seen any of the films, and they're probably amazing. I can't imagine doing a better job than this book does, though. So that's my recommendation for, I think Eric Maria Remarque wins this round. But between John Steinbeck and Hemingway, I personally prefer John Steinbeck. I think his writing was fantastic. But if you're not into short stories, if you're not into vignettes, you're probably not going to enjoy it. You might very well enjoy A Farewell to Arms more. Thank you so much for checking out this review, read-along response to Emma and Carolyn's Game of Tomes for January and February for these two war novels. I'm going to be reading for March, David Copperfield. I'm actually loving it. I'm shocked. I don't like Dickens. I tried him again last year. Still didn't really like him. But I will recommend the Richard Armitage audiobook version of this. On Audible, I got it for, I think, free. I don't think it made me use a credit for it. It's worth checking out, but who is he? He's Thorin Oakenshield, I think, in The Hobbit. His reading is phenomenal, and I think it's adding so much to my understanding and enjoyment of this novel if I was reading it with my eyes. So I highly, highly recommend. I don't remember the book is for April. I'm going to have to figure that out. But yeah. Oh, I think it's Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which I've also never read. So I will be making my reading vlogs and responses on those. And like I said, I'm going to link the Game of Tomes video from Emma and Carolyn down below. Check it out. This is their discussion video where they're comparing the two and giving their thoughts. And they're the polar opposite of mine. So I definitely recommend checking it out because I think it's super important to get different points of view. Thank you so much for joining. I will see you in my next one. Please take care of yourself, take care of others, and keep reading.